Welcome to this meeting of the Foundation for Science and Technology. My name is David Willits. I chair the foundation, and today we're going to focus on the hot topic of creating a UK ARPA and how we make a success of it. This, of course, is an idea proposed by the government. It appears in its R&D roadmap. There's lots of important questions about how it should work and what its priorities should be. And the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee is currently conducting an inquiry into the proposals for UK ARPA. So I'm delighted that in our three panelists, we'll begin with the Right Honourable Greg Clark MP, who chairs that committee, previously, of course, having been Secretary of State in BEIS, and who has made some fantastic contributions to the Foundation of Science and Technology over his career. So it's good to have an old friend of the foundation back. And after we've heard from Greg, we'll then hear from Dr. Ruth Mckernan, who was, of course, the head of Innovate UK and who has now moved on to working in support of UK biotechs as a venture partner with SV Health Investors and also leads the Dementia Discovery Fund. We'll then hear from Felicity Birch, Director of Innovation and Digital at the CBI. And finally, leading the questions will be Sarah Hodgits, who is the Programme Director within BEIS, actually charged with delivering UK ARPA. They'll then, after each speaker has spoken for about 10 minutes, there'll then be time for questions. Do put your questions on the Q&A function, not the chat function. And of course, you can start putting your questions down at the beginning, and then you can upvote the questions that really seem to you to be the most relevant, the most urgent, and it helps me as chair identify the questions to turn to. So now it's time for our first speaker, Greg Clark. Welcome to the foundation again. We very much look forward to hearing your observations. Over to you.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's good to be back. I hope that it won't be long before we can get back together and enjoy each other's convivial company in person. And it's always one of the big assets of the foundation that we can meet and chat in the way that we normally do. But on this subject, as you say, David, the committee which I chair, the Science and Technology Committee, has been conducting an inquiry. In fact, we've just finished taking evidence and we are weighing up our conclusions. You may indulge me by allowing me to take some of the conclusions of the discussions that you reach to inform my members' consideration of the evidence that we've held. It may be that we've got some members of my committee on the call and they may want to speak later. But I will speak in a personal capacity and don't want to preempt what our conclusions might be. During our inquiry, we've taken evidence from a fascinating array of people, including past and present senior executives at DARPA in the US, academics in the US and the UK and European countries, both the current and the former chief executives of UKRI and the science minister. And so I think there are a few things that I would say from that consideration. And one of the things we've been thinking about is the case for a UK ARPA. And the first thing to say is that the context is very important. Because the most important part of the context, it seems to me, is this: that the science and research budget is set to increase from £12 billion a year to £22 billion a year by 2024-25. An extraordinary advance. David, during your time as science minister during the coalition, you did a heroic job in protecting the science budget in cash terms. When cuts were being made across government departments, you got flat cash for science. When I was science minister, managed to get flat real funding from the Treasury. And when I was business secretary, we managed to increase the funding from £9 billion a year to £12 billion a year. But all of that, I think, fades by comparison with the intention to nearly double the science budget. And the relevance of that is that I think this new agency, were it to be competing with for existing resources, were it destined to cannibalize program budgets and budgets that are already there, I think might be viewed in a different way. But £800 million, very significant sum of money, but in the context of an increase of £10 billion a year in the science budget by the end of the Parliament, I think does give possibilities for doing things that wouldn't be possible in a world in which the budget were not increasing. The second piece of context that I think is important, and so far is unknown, is the future of industrial strategy in terms of the government's purview. When we established the industrial strategy in 2017, we established an industrial strategy challenge fund that in many ways had some characteristics of what is being proposed for ARPA, which is to say that it had in mind multidisciplinary strategic projects with an eye to developing capability to meet future needs. And to give just a few examples of that, perhaps a topical one, the VMIC, the Vaccines Manufacturing Innovation Centre. Back in 2018, we thought that it was desirable and perhaps prudent to deliberately develop vaccine manufacturing capability that we could use to respond at pace to then unknown future needs such as pandemics, and to have a scale that we could vaccinate the whole country. Now that, I think most people would agree, is something that is being proved to be a wise course and a wise use of research money. Similarly, the Faraday Challenge was through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, was there to develop UK battery manufacturing capability on the basis that we would need this if we were to prosper in future in automotive. And the Faraday Institution and the National Battery Manufacturing Centre, Coventry, were set up to pursue this. And again, what we're seeing now is that the phasing out of cars with internal combustion engines and the move to net zero is making that appropriate. So one question that I think will determine both whether we need an ARPA and its remit is whether there will be a continuation of this new and I would say important departure. One of the things that the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund has done is to deploy for relatively long-term commitments public funds, but also as a condition leveraged in funds from the private sector. And of the £5.6 billion that has been invested in these challenges, 2.6 has been public money from the science budget and 3 billion from private sources. So I think some clarity on that will be necessary. I hope that it will continue, and that may mean that ARPA can have a narrower focus if it were to continue. But if the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund were not to continue, then I think there is it would be desirable for this new institution to take up some of the strain there. But finally, in terms of what I think were we to have a UK ARPA, what it might look like. Well, I think, and Sir Geoffrey Owen has written and talked about this, I think there is an important space for an institution that can look to invest and develop capability in, rather than incremental improvements in technologies, significant leaps, one might say, through sustained funding, and especially where those developments are unlikely to be produced by either industry or academia alone. And so a focus on technological transformation seems to be something that would be desirable. The evidence we've taken clearly establishes that it needs to have a clear mission, that it should be able to take more risks than perhaps UKRI is, whether culturally or in terms of its statute and the responsibility it has through the accounting officer to the Treasury and government to be able to take on. There should be a greater ability to take on more risky projects. We think that, certainly I think that the translational potential is something that should be a criteria that may be used for this. One of the things that, in evidence to the committee, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Julia King, said that, I think she captures it quite well. The gap I see in our research and innovation landscape is science push, helping great scientific ideas escape from the laboratory into applications which enable a step change in the way current technologies or processes work, or into applications that no one has yet thought of. That seems to be a good broad remit that then needs to be translated into particular challenges. The risk of failure, I think, needs to be accommodated clearly and explicitly from the beginning, and perhaps part and parcel of that should be a commitment to long-term funding, so that there is confidence that perhaps initial setbacks don't prove fatal to the ambition that's set up. So that is perhaps a personal take on some of the evidence that we've taken. My committee will be drawing that together and making our conclusions during the next few weeks, so that the government can then reflect on what we advise before it makes its own mind up as to what might be the form and indeed the function of this proposed organisation.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Greg. A lot of very pertinent issues identified there that we'll want to focus on for the rest of our session. Thank you so much. We're next going to go straight to Ruth Mckernan. Ruth Mckernan, who is a distinguished neuroscientist, worked at Merck and at Pfizer, and of course was then Chief Executive of Innovate UK for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018, when some of those challenges that Greg describes were being developed. So Ruth, we very much look forward to your observations. Turn on your video and let's roll.
Okay, I hope you can see me. Yep. And also I do have some slides, David, so if that's okay, I am going to take the screen.
Yep.
Which hopefully this will work. Now, can you see what's on my screen here?
At the moment, we're still seeing you, Ruth.
Okay, let me just give it another go.
In my experience, the more distinguished the scientists, the harder they find the screen share function.
Well, I must be, yeah, let's not go there. I just have to. Am I sharing now?
I'm afraid I'm still not seeing the slides. I think in a moment you're going to have to.
It says it's invalid.
Ah.
So let's try again. Screen share. Gavin, maybe you have to give me something to get this to work.
I think I've given you the permissions, Ruth. If it's not working, we can share from our end.
Oh, rats.
So Gavin,
yeah, you might need to do that.
Yeah, let's share from, if you've got the screen, if you've got the slides as well, Gavin, let's put them on from our end. Here we are. Right.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm going to talk about here follows on really well from what the Minister said. And I'm going to start with the hypothesis, the proposal, that ARPA is a public sector new technology venture fund. And that's the way that we should think about it. And I've drawn on conversations and work from a lot of people here, and I've just listed them on the bottom there. So Gavin, if you could move on to the next slide. This is how I'm going to talk through this proposal. Have you moved it on?
I think, Ruth, you keep talking, and Gavin hasn't been able to move it on yet, but we don't want to lose too much time. You keep talking.
No, okay.
Let's go.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to have to just do something here so that I can see the slides myself. Right, so my outline here is that I believe ARPA's role is to deliver technology solutions for national security challenges. And the focus here should be speed and delivery. And when I talk about national security challenges, I mean that quite broadly. So some of the things the Minister referred to really, that could be a public health challenge. It could be an energy...
Ex-Minister, Ruth.
Sorry, ex-Minister. Okay. So it could be a public health challenge, an energy security challenge, or a digital security challenge, any of those things. And what I'm drawing on here is my learning from Innovate UK. And as you rightly said, Greg, the work that was done in developing the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund was one that I led with some of my colleagues, with Kevin Bourne and Mike Biddle. And there's a lot, I think, to learn from that. So while we were looking at the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, we spent time talking to people from DARPA. We had a group over from there. And in the next slide, I'm going to compare Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, DARPA, and where I believe ARPA UK should sit. I think it's important that we consider it to be like a venture fund, to have the sense of a venture fund. Obviously, it's not there to make returns, but the feel of a venture fund with the speed and the flexibility that comes with it, I think is a good way of looking at it. And then lastly, a straw man proposal. It's going to be wrong. Of course, it's going to be wrong, but let's just get into the details of what ARPA might look like. So on the next slide, if you get the chance to look at it now or later, I'm going to go through the purpose, the oversight, governance, and then talk something about the scale, funding, and the difficulty in recruiting people. So the purpose for DARPA and ARPA, I think, is national security broadly. And DARPA always said that their investment or their funding was so that they wouldn't be strategically surprised. The ISCF, the Challenge Fund, is quite different. Its goal was to stimulate the UK economy and to raise productivity. It wasn't about security, and it certainly wasn't to have government as a customer. It was to have business growth and customers very broadly. And the way that it was set up, we started by engaging with business, by selecting the challenges with business, ideas that would be very valuable in bringing in revenue and growing businesses in the UK. So there was a partnership with industry and government from the very beginning. You know, it's a big chunk of public funding, so there is some strong oversight. In fact, I would say that the ISCF has really not wanted for governance at all. It has some scrutiny at all levels. So from UKRI through BEIS through Treasury, of course, many levels of approval authority, so challenge directors up to 10 million, and then increasing levels of oversight and authority for spend, so 4 levels of oversight. So really a very rigorous and well-controlled programme, 2.7 billion, currently 20 challenges, as you said, they range from 33 million, the audience of the future, the smallest, up to 274 million, which is the Faraday Battery Challenge, and it requires matched funding. DARPA and ARPA, I think, have some differences. So as well as the purpose, The oversight is really light for DARPA. So there's an annual report to Congress, and it's overseen by the DARPA director who is appointed by Congress. And I think it's really important that ARPA UK maintains as light as possible an oversight so that the challenge directors are able to work at speed and really be very competitive. So I would propose a single high-level board. We can talk about what that's going to be in a minute. And the program leaders, the people who are going to lead the programs, are hired together with their business plan, as happens with DARPA, and that they are funded for 3 years in the first instance, and they are really left to build their program and deliver in the way that a chief executive would be, having been funded by a venture fund and provided their business case for how they want to do that. So approval authority, I've come up with a thought that the program leaders, as I'm calling them, should actually be assigned to a host institute. And that host institute need not sit within UKRI. So it could be NPL, it could be VMIC, as you said, it could be a catapult centre like the Energy Systems Centre or a Royce Institute. But I believe an arm's length body, an arm's length institute would be a good place for them to be. And there are actually several hundred of them in the UK. It's important that it doesn't have matched funding, no labs, so a virtual organisation under the programme leader, and has complete focus to deliver on the business plan that has been laid out. When it comes to recruitment and salary, this is a difficult one. It was difficult to find challenge leaders for the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, so maybe 50 to 100 candidates before we found them, and they are UKR employees. When I left UKRI, I think it was something in the range of 120,000 was the salary for, in my experience, for a biotech company operating maybe £50 million worth of investment. An average salary would be more like 180,000, and that wouldn't be out of line with DARPA. So if we go on to the next slide, if you're able to show it, I'll just give you a flavour of why I think it's important to think like a venture organisation and think of this as a CEO given opportunity to deliver. So George Heilmeyer, who was the DARPA director in the 70s, crafted a set of questions on which to evaluate proposed research programs. And these have become really well known as the Heilmeyer Catechism. And they cover what you're doing, how it's done, what's the approach, who the customer is, what are the risks, what will it cost, how long will it take, what are the midterm and final exams. And they really match very well with a venture investment checklist on all of the things that you want to see in a business plan, and you want to get the sense that this will work before money will be assigned to a CEO and put to work. And in my last slide, I'm just going to go through what I would describe as the proposal in high level. So it is to deliver on national security challenges with focus and speed, and therefore needs to be light touch. I would regard ARPA as an agency which is virtual and takes advantage of existing infrastructure, no new bricks and mortar, and actually is more like a budget line than an agency, and should have no additional legislation in order to get it up and running. The program leaders should be entrepreneurial CEO style leaders, and it would be good to draw on people who have been serial entrepreneurs or who have been investors or venture partners in venture organizations. They would gather around them a small and predominantly industrial advisory group. So important for them to have the advice that they need in order to help them deliver. And there would be a single high-level oversight board, and we should draw widely across science, technology and government here. So I'm thinking of the level of the chair of UKRI, Council of Science and Technology, the government chief scientific advisors, a useful representative of ministers from BEIS and Treasury, or their delegates, and maybe one or two others. So the board I just described would select the challenge areas broadly. I think that's a government role to select the challenge areas, and then the programme leaders, based on the people and the business plan, would be selected by the board. I think Innovate UK could very happily run the process, and funding would be provided as a ring-fence budget line to a suitable host institution that the programme leader would choose themselves. The programme leader would be able to manage projects as they see fit, so they could sponsor research in a university department, in a business, in a contract research organisation. It's their choice, and they would have a budget allocation up to them to use it as they see fit. And then, of course, we already have some processes in place to allow follow-on funding through existing organisations such as Innovate UK, getting investment from other parts of the investment ecosystem, such as the British Business Bank. And we would be looking for them to deliver intellectual property, licensing, and solutions to the challenges that government have set out. And then government, I would expect, to be procuring those solutions as they are delivered. And I am going to pause there. Even without slides, I hope you were able to follow what I was saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Actually, our team at the FST were able to get the slides to work alongside your talk. So that was all fine.
Good.
Thank you very much for that. Let's third turn to Felicity Birch, who is Director of Innovation and Digital at the CBI, and in previous roles at the CBI as well. I know she has a long-standing interest in R&D policy and is a considerable expert on it in her own right. Felicity, thanks so much for doing this. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I think there's a lot for me to build on in the previous two brilliant presentations. So I'm going to focus in on a couple of things. So not just how you set UK ARPA up for success, but also what success might look like, and particularly what success might look like from the perspective of the business community. So firstly, I think one thing that's really important is that UK ARPA does have the potential to set the UK up to be a science superpower. We are at a really unique moment in UK history. We obviously have the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis that has unfortunately resulted from that. But we've also had Brexit. And for me, Brexit is making a choice about who we are as a nation. And we now need to demonstrate what we're going to do with that choice. And we need to demonstrate to the rest of the world what an independent UK can do and who an independent UK is. And one of the things that government has talked about really clearly is about making the UK a science superpower. And I was thinking a bit about what does that mean and what could that mean? And for me, you know, the role of a superpower suggests that the UK science is influential and it's impactful all around the world. And I think ARPA does have a potential to play a role there, especially if we focus in on using ARPA to solve specific social or economic challenges, and ones that are challenges all around the world, such as things like health or net zero, where the UK has the potential to lead the way. But it's not just an opportunity to sort of set the tone in terms of who the UK is. It's also an opportunity to solve problems with our existing innovation ecosystem. And I was thinking about two in particular. So firstly, around leveraging business investment. The UK is brilliant at science and innovation. We all know this, but for a long time, we haven't done enough of either of them. You know, I'm sure everyone listening to this call will know how stubbornly UK R&D has stayed at around 1.7% of GDP. And as Greg Clark mentioned in his intervention, we're in a landscape of increasing government spending on R&D, which is very exciting. But the only times countries have successfully raised the level of their own R&D overall R&D, sorry, is where they've leveraged in business innovation as well. So I think we need to design ARPA in a way that can help achieve that goal. And I was struck by the comments from Greg Clark, actually, that they'd heard that the UK suffered from a lack of science pull. I don't think that the business community would always reflect on it that way. And actually, there are concerns that there's not enough sort of market pull rather than sort of science push. And we do need to make sure that we're creating the market in the UK for innovation. I'll say a little bit more on that later. And then the second thing I thought it would be useful for ARPA to look at is playing a role in levelling up. About half of R&D investment in the UK happens in London, the southeast and the east of England, although there's brilliant R&D all around the country, and we know R&D plays a really important role in driving growth. So potentially funding and establishing the new agency outside of London could serve as a catalyst for regional growth. And potentially establishing it around one of the sort of growing regional hubs for research would be a good way to look at doing this. Not only would that support levelling up, but it could also help unlock a wider pool of talent from around the UK. So those are some of the things I think we should, some of our ambitions that I think that we should have for ARPA. In terms of how you make that happen, there are three key things, and this does very much overlap with comments from Greg and from Ruth, but three key things that I think are really important here. The first is around a long-term funding model. The second, setting ARPA up to take risks. And then the final one, very much looking to that point about leveraging in investment, is designing ARPA with the business community in mind. So I'll say a little bit about each of those. So first, on the long-term funding model, industry is not looking for a flash in the pan. Feast and famine, chop and change is the opposite of good innovation policy. I say this a lot, but one of the strongest levers that government has at its disposal when it comes to spurring private sector innovation isn't the money, although the money does matter. It's the signals that government creates with where it chooses to invest and how long it chooses to invest for. And I think the US model of DARPA really exemplifies this. DARPA has existed for 60 years and it receives over $3 billion per year in funding. Now, looking back to what that might mean for the UK, I know research that David Willits has done has suggested that funding would need to be about £200 million a year to have sort of similar impact at a UK level. So the initial £800 million, proposed over 5 years for the government represents a pretty decent starting point towards that. Though I think following the spending review, there is some question about sort of how immediately all of this will be directed towards ARPA. Given this uncertainty, piloting a UK ARPA at a small scale could work before putting its funding on a sustained footing. But if we're going to do that, we shouldn't just pilot it and forget it. If the initial model doesn't work, let's iterate until we build something that does. This is how businesses scale. It's really tough for government to make something work like that. Government doesn't want to be seen to have sort of got things wrong in the first place. But, you know, if ARPA is our big innovative play, then we need to make sure that we're building something that can work really well. And I think, therefore, it does need a strong sponsor in government to make sure that happens. So the next thing was around setting ARPA up to take risks, but you can see it's very linked to the previous point. And the key benefit of the US ARPA model is its ability to encourage high-risk research, which wouldn't happen if it was left to the market alone. And I think both the previous speakers talked to that point a bit as well. I think there are two aspects to why it's really good at this. So firstly is around independence, and the second is around the customer relationship. And on independence, we know, we've heard from other speakers, that the US agency operates outside of traditional oversight structures and departments, and this allows it to pursue high-risk innovation that the market wouldn't, and potentially government funders wouldn't, because they're concerned about sort of value for money and return to taxpayers, which are obviously really important considerations. But in the UK, you know, it does look like ARPA will sit outside of UKRI, which may give it some of that independence. But I think one thing we do need to look to when we're doing that is sort of what's the brand for UK ARPA? How do we engage businesses in the science and innovation community with it? Because we do need to have a kind of coherent innovation support system. So I just think making sure that we're looking at independence and coherence together as much as we can. And then on the customer relationship, and for me, this is probably the one point I'd really want people to take home the most from all of this, because ultimately, when it comes to a company, the reason that they develop new products and services, the reason they invest in early stage research, is because they expect a market for it at some point. And actually, government can play a vital role here in creating new markets with its procurement approach. I've spoken to quite a lot of businesses who've talked to me about why they choose to invest in R&D in the UK, or potentially choose to invest in R&D outside of the UK. And where they do invest outside of the UK, it's often linked to bigger market opportunities elsewhere. So really important that the government is using its buying power as much as possible to support innovation. And the success of the ARPA program in the US is really down to that extended pipeline model, where the Department of Defense plays a vital role. I liked Ruth's characterization of kind of solving national security challenges through ARPA and using a sort of broad definition of that. And there's a few areas such as health or energy where I think key departments like the NHS could play a real role in acting as a lead customer there. And then my final point, I've just spotted I have 2 minutes to go. My final point is about designing ARPA with the business community in mind. While obviously government's going to create ARPA, industry expertise and funding will be an important factor in its long-term ability to bridge that gap between blue sky research and marketable products. So government and business need to work together closely to develop that new agency. And for me, there's a few key factors there. Firstly, a brilliant brand. The agency's brand is going to need to be bold if it's going to compete internationally and attract investment. To do this, government must be ambitious with its marketing of ARPA, identify a new name and a mission statement which inspires and encompasses its purpose and vision. And this will also help attract the brightest researchers from around the world. The second is practical, but get IP right. Intellectual property agreements can often be the blocker between really good collaborations on innovation. And the final one is design funding in a way that works for business. Ruth talked a bit about making sure that there's not match funding, but one of the other things we've also heard from businesses is the US ARPA model is really good because it has funding in 10-year increments with 3-year gates where they check in if the project is successfully delivering, but the assumption is the funding is there if the project is working. So I think there's quite a lot in that, but some really practical steps we can take to get ARPA right and get this right. And I do think it presents an opportunity to help the UK to be a science and innovation superpower post-Brexit.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Felicity. Now I'm just going to turn briefly before we move to the Q&A session to Sarah Hodgits, who is Deputy Director in the R&D Directorate at Bayes and is directly involved in the delivery of UK ARPA. So your comments, Sarah, on what you've heard so far.
Thank you very much, and I intend to be brief because I'm really looking forward to comments from the virtual floor here. I'm delighted to hear the panel's kind of broad support for what we're trying to achieve here for UK ARPA, but recognise there are many ways to deliver this ambition. Just wanted to be clear about the kind of how high the level of ambition is in government to make this a new way of funding. There is in no way an intention to replicate what we already have in our fantastic funding landscape. Definitely needs to be complementary and to be doing something very different. So without letting any cats out of the bag, we will be establishing UK ARPA and recruiting its leadership this calendar year. But the discussion is definitely still live. So this debate is playing into our thinking as we move forward. So again, grateful for the thoughts of the panel already and really look forward to comments and questions from the virtual floor. Thank you.
Can I invite our panelists now to turn on their cameras and we'll go to the Q&A session. And look, the questions that have been coming in are fantastic and a tribute to the expertise of the people who participate in our FST events. Let's jump straight in with a very strong theme that's emerging, which is how will this institution fit in to what is already quite a complicated landscape with a range of institutions and funding bodies. That's a widely shared concern that appears in several of the questions. I'm going to go through in the order that we started with Greg first. Any observations on that?
Well, the experience of the US ARPA that became DARPA is that it shouldn't fit in too neatly and too closely. The witnesses that we had talked about it being an island with a bridge. So it was connected to the wider research environment, but it was very definitely offshore, and it was a bridge rather than something that enveloped it. And the reasons for that are obvious. DARPA has its own culture, and it is distinct from the culture of the other parts of the US funding system. Sure, one of the consequences of that is that there is a risk of duplication. Now, I think there are different types of duplication. Clearly, you don't want to have yet another set of calls with slightly different criteria that involve everyone in a lot of bureaucracy. But duplication in the sense of perhaps doing some of the same things as UKRI funded projects, but perhaps doing them in a different way, that type of duplication, I think, is something that ought not to be forbidden, and indeed, close to home and recently, the fact that we have multiple vaccines being developed against the coronavirus, I think is not a kind of duplication that I would want to suppress, and so I think that thought has to be there. I wouldn't be too neat in looking for it to kind of slot into the system. Right.
Thanks very much, Ruth.
Yes, thank you. I would slightly disagree a bit, I think, and form must follow function here. And we need to really focus on what the challenges are that people are going to try and solve, and be able to use absolutely everything at their disposal to do that, whether it exists within our current structure for research and innovation or outside it. So let me think of just a hypothetical challenge to make my point. If we now believed that in order to get vaccines out to the population, a challenge should be something like a needleless vaccination that could be delivered to the whole population in a week. If you were going to work on that, would you want to be in an agency that had challenges that were of the energy and digital type, or would you want to be housed together with people who were vaccination and vaccination technology experts, and to be able to draw on that as well as other things? So I think once you consider the form, rather than compressing everybody together in one agency, you should consider providing a budget line to the person that's trying to solve that challenge and letting them sit where they want and draw on whatever technology is available to them, and thereby provide more freedom than you would to the group en masse in a new agency.
Thanks. Felicity?
So I think this is the killer question when it comes to UK ARPA, is how it fits in with the rest of the landscape. And one of my concerns with this approach is the coherence. When we look at sort of why businesses engage with any sort of innovation support that's out there, very often the reason that they don't engage with it is because they don't know about it, and that's because things have sort of changed really regularly. But I do think that ARPA presents a bit of an opportunity, if we get it right, to build something new and build something that excites businesses about innovation and excites international investors. So I think you have to balance out those challenges. And I quite like the point of sort of not being too neat. And actually, there is a bit of an opportunity here, because we are expecting sort of further work from the government around innovation strategy, to make sure that all of these things do at least talk to each other, even if there is some overlap. But the other thing which is an opportunity for this is government could learn a little bit from large businesses and their own approaches to innovation with the delivery of policy here. So one of the things we've seen large companies and CBI membership do from time to time, I'll call it love your silos. It's experiment within individual departments of the business. So try a new thing in a sort of small contained area. And if it works, other areas can learn from it. So if we experiment with ARPA and take a more risk forward approach to innovation funding, and it works really well, delivers evidence of the value of this kind of investment, couldn't we use that to scale up some of the programs that really matter within Innovate UK and UKRI and give government a bit more confidence about investing in risk overall? I think that's a huge opportunity if we get this right.
Yeah, thanks. Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think one of the questions I think we're answering as a nation with this new funding body is, how do we reach the science that the other part of the systems don't reach at the moment? So actually, this is not so much, echoing what Greg said earlier, it's not so much whether it does the same kind of science, that kind of duplication I don't think we're worried about, it's how it does it. It's the processes and the methods it uses in its unique cultural identity that will be complementary to the rest of the system.
Right, thanks. Of course, I should just observe that I think, certainly in the days of Dominic Cummings, there was quite a lively debate about this, because we would have had ARPA up and running already if UKRI had been given the task of creating it. There was already a legal framework, kind of like creating an extra research council, and UKRI would have done its best to have it as at arm's length and as autonomous and risk-bearing as possible. But Dominic was so keen it should be completely separate from the rest of the system. He wanted primary legislation, and that hasn't happened. There may be secondary legislation, and that probably the pursuit of that purest autonomy is one of the things that slowed up the process. Let's move to another strand, which goes back to our opening comments, because both Greg and Ruth referred to it as a sort of technology transformation function. And that is, I think, very exciting and something that would help deliver leaps in technology, I think Greg said. But there is, again, an alternative view, and I'm sorry to refer back again to Dominic Cummings. That wasn't what Dominic thought ARPA should be. He was much more preoccupied. He thought there was over regulation and bureaucracy of blue skies research. He really wanted it to be operating at the furthest reaches of physics or systems biology rather than applying technologies. Are we heading for an ARPA that is in some way or other an applied technology agency? And is that the right vision? And should we worry about the original Cummings critique that we really need to fund blue skies research? Let's start at the other end. Felicity, why don't you set the ball rolling on that? What exactly is it? Is it to plug the valley of death, or is it so that the wildest and wackiest ideas in the outre parts of scientific theory get properly funded?
Well, it could be both. I think the way I set it out in my talk was very much focused on how do we solve some of the problems that the business community has identified with the innovation ecosystem, and I think that pull through to market, the valley of death, is a problem. But it's going to be the biggest problem when it comes to the boldest and the brightest ideas. The thing I was most inspired by when I was listening to some of the evidence that was being given to the Science and Technology Select Committee was this idea of sort of user-generated research and that link through. And actually, I think probably the closest model that we've had to doing some of that in the UK is some of the catalysts, which I think were started under you, David, which have really look at basic innovation, the basic research all the way through to market. But what could be really different here is that government procurement and market link at the end.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. Ruth, over to you.
Yes, I'd agree on government procurement being very important. And actually, I would question whether we don't already have the processes to deliver really wonderful blue skies research. We've got the Graphene Institute that came out of graphene research that was done. We put, I believe it's 900 million into Future Leaders programs, where we're asking our best and our brightest to come up with really novel program areas that we would invest in and their personal development. So I think we have a lot of instruments already within and outside UKRI for really exciting early research and for translational research. And I also think we should let the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, with its partnered work with industry, we should see that through. We should give that long enough to let it develop and let businesses grow in that process. So the bit that I think is missing is the very loosely monitored, very fast, very entrepreneurial development of technologies for a purpose that we need, and we need now. And picking the right people to lead those challenges, I think that's going to be the difficult bit.
Thanks. Greg, where do you stand on this debate?
So again, I mean, this is why I talked about the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, because it all depends whether we've got that. If we have it, then it can be more blue sky, because we would then have a vigorous program of making sure that the ideas that we have do have mechanisms to translate them and to obtain advantage out of them. So I do think that with the birth of ARPA, we do need to have some clarity as to whether it still is an ambition of government. And I quoted the examples that I did about vaccines manufacturing and the Faraday Challenge to show that I think the early signs, it is very early, it's just 2 or 3 years into this. I don't think you can say that this was the wrong track, and so I hope it will continue. And then you could have perhaps a more Cummings-esque version that is the blue sky, if the translational side is covered off. But I think there's one thing to be cautious about, and I noticed in the questions that Sir Anton Muscatelli at Glasgow made a very important point, that we can't vest all our hopes in this one institution. It is an increase in funding, or it is a new institution with £200 million a year of funding, a very small proportion of even the increase that we're having. So we can't place too many burdens of expectations and requirements on it. Otherwise, it will collapse under the strain of it. As is proposed, it has to be very tight in its scope, it seems to me. And it also shouldn't mean that some of these broader questions, which are really about whether UKRI and how it's, again, a new institution, how it should adapt and reform itself, that we shouldn't exempt the rest of the funding and the research system from that discussion and say, well, everything has to be done by this new edition.
Right. Thank you very much. And Sarah, do you want to comment? And also, you might just want to say what the public statements are on the funding for this body, because it is all still quite a tight and constrained environment. You just want to remind us what the official position is on the amount it will have and how it will.
Yeah, absolutely. The manifesto sets that it will have 800 million across the next 5 years. Obviously, we are rapidly approaching the first year of its operation, and I imagine that this will be over an upward taper from now going forward, because colleagues will know that spending money quickly is difficult in this area. More broadly on this, what it should focus on and which end of the kind of TRL level, or at the end of blue skies, or close to market. The jury is really out, and it's fascinating to hear all of the panel's views on this. One thing I would say, and reflecting on, it's less than 2% of the overall R&D budget. So I do echo what Gregor said there. So it's less than 2%, but it's a very important 2% of the budget. And I wondered, one of the thoughts that we have a team is that it needs to be really tight in its own decision making, spending that money well, because it isn't very much money and it can't be spread thinly in the way that UKRI is able to spread its wings across lots of research and development. But it could be broad in its scope and broad in its remit. But it doesn't have to be at blue skies or at the technology end, but it needs to take the big bets that we require.
Right. Thanks very much. I think there's going to be time for one more round of questions. I'm going to try to sort of a double header, and I'll give the last word to Greg as the chair of the select committee. And there's first of all a question about risk. We all say, especially in politics, of course, this has got to be able to take bigger risks than conventional funding streams. But the reality of is that taking risks comes with a high political price. We all know the terror of being summoned before the PAC to explain why something hasn't worked. And who knows, perhaps even Greg's committee if things don't work out. So do we really think this is going to get away with taking as much risk as we're all claiming? I think it would be hearing people's observations on that would be very interesting. And secondly, procurement. Several people have touched on procurement, and it's clearly a key part of the way in which ARPA operates in the US. But without primary legislation, are we really going to have an agency that can be tied into public procurement and fund innovation that way? Ruth, why don't you comment first? Then I'll go to Felicity, Sarah, and we'll end with Greg, a kind of minute each.
I'd like us to focus on things that business won't do and requires a very fast and focused solution, which is why I think urgent security, broadly, security challenges are a good place to start, maybe with only 3 broad challenge areas to start with. So leaders can put forward a proposal within that challenge area. And fundamentally, I believe if we don't have the appetite to take risk and give people we trust based on what they've done in the past, if we can't give them freedom to deliver, then we should put the money through existing organisations. You know, let's not migrate back to the mean and keep pulling things up to see if they're growing. Freedom is critical here.
Thanks very much. Felicity?
Well, on risk, I think ARPA has to be high risk, high reward. So it will need to take a portfolio approach, and one would hope that it will succeed in a big way on a few of its projects. But I also think that there is a role for government committees like the Science and Technology Select Committee to understand the role that ARPA is playing there and make sure that the scrutiny is appropriate to the risks that ARPA is being expected to take. On procurement, I've noticed a few of the comments have spoken about the procurement white paper as well, and I think that there is a bit of scope for that procurement white paper to look more closely at the role that it can play in delivering innovation and the role of ARPA within that. I don't have a lot of detail on that at the moment, but I do think making that link work is going to be crucial to making ARPA work as well.
Thank you. Sarah?
Risk is absolutely fundamental to this. This is why it's going to be different to what we already have. So establishing a new risk tolerance in the minds of the people that are running it and the people that, like myself, will be in the control environment for it is really, really critical to its establishment.
Thanks. And finally, Greg, your parting observations on the discussion we've had.
Well, thanks, David. I think on risk, I mean, this is one of the reasons to set up something new and perhaps apart from the existing structure, because it comes with that expectation around it. And certainly my committee and perhaps even the Public Accounts Committee might bear in mind what its provenance is from that point of view. And as I understand it, this is one reason for primary legislation. Because it is the case that organizations with accounting officers in the conventional way require a ministerial direction to engage in expenditure that is novel or contentious. Now, pretty much what the remit of this organization is to engage in things that are certainly novel and may even be contentious. So I do think, you know, creating something that very explicitly is licensed to take risks, I think is important. But, and here's a cautionary tale, if we think, as some of the evidence that we've had before our committee, including a very powerful and pungent statement from the University of Oxford, who were very critical that the whole research funding system is too risk averse, then let's not, by setting this up, ignore the this question that hovers over the whole of the research system. I'd be concerned if that were the case. On procurement, yes, and one of the features of the US system, DARPA started as ARPA, but it had the D for defense put in there because it was thought necessary to have a customer, and the Department of Defense was to be that customer. We've thought about this, and I saw again a comment in the comments stream from Lord West, who obviously has ministerial experience as a defence minister, and indeed, of course, in the Royal Navy as an admiral. And the concern is that if you make a particular government department, whether it's the Ministry of Defence or perhaps for health challenges, the Department of Health and Social Care, if they are the customer, then really you have to give them the money for it. And the experience that I think Lord West points to is that these research programs tend to get gobbled up when there's an emergency that requires their use elsewhere. The NHS will always have these things, and perhaps even the military will. And so my concern about that model, where you hand over the money to a particular department, is that it might evaporate. It might find its way into other uses. So I think that points to creating an institution that is robust, is expected to be risk-taking, and has licenses given to it, even formally and in statute, to reinforce that.
Very interesting. Good. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, to Greg and Felicity and Ruth, to Sarah for joining in as well, and which of course helps to ensure that this feeds into the ministerial decisions, as well, of course, as to Greg's Select Committee's deliberations. And finally, thank you to all our participants, over 200, and the questions, the astute and shrewd questions, were a kind of roll of honor of people who are experts on science and technology in the UK. And it's great that they all come to help and contribute to our FST events. So thank you all very much indeed. Our next event is on the 24th of February and is entitled, Will Hydrogen Technologies Get Us to Net Zero? So we look forward to seeing you then, and perhaps even one of these days back at the Royal Society with dinner afterwards. Thank you all very much indeed.